So it is my pleasure to introduce you to our moderator for the AML Thought Leaders panel, Alma Angadi. Alma is a partner in financial services branch of Guidehouse. She is their global legislative and regulatory risk leader for their global investigations and compliance division. She is also a key advisor on the ATII Advisory Council. And a special thank you to Guidehouse for generously sponsoring our summit. Alma, thank you for moderating the AML Thought Leaders panel today. Please take it from here.
I will certainly be delighted to do that, Sam. Thank you. So this is a particularly fun panel for me because everybody on this page, we've known each other for a long time. We've all been working in financial crime for a long time. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction, but let me just tell you, you have some of the best minds in this area on our panel today. We're really lucky to have everyone, and I think it's going to be incredibly enlightening. So Phil DeLuca is a senior vice president at US Bank. Jim Richards is a principal and founder of RegTech Consulting. And Jim, I don't know if you remember, but you did a training just after September 11th for the securities industry when I was still at FinCEN. Yep. So he was a real luminary even at the very beginning. Carol Baumier, who's a senior managing director at Protiviti, and Fred Curry, who's the executive leader of the U.S. anti-money laundering and economic sanctions practice at Deloitte. You can find their bios in the materials. You'll be incredibly impressed. With that, we're just going to set the stage and then get started. So the next slide, please, Sam. Just a little bit of a reminder that there is a difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. Human trafficking is a form of modern slavery. It's compelled labor. It's recruiting, harboring, and transporting by force, fraud, or coercion. Human smuggling can be just as horrific, but there tends to be an element of it's more of a business transaction, and oftentimes the individuals being smuggled have paid to do so and want to do so. That doesn't mean that they're treated well or that it's any less of a crime. So let's go to the next slide just quickly. And I know you've seen these statistics before, but as we start our discussion, I do think it's important to focus on the enormity of this issue. $150 billion in annual profits. This is big business. 40 million victims. 1 in 4 are children. And it doesn't take much for you to be horrified by that. And 99% of the victims are women and girls. So, stuff, but let's see what the financial industry is doing about this. We can go, I think, just to the agenda or whatever the next slide is. Yeah. So let's start with you, Jim. You know, early on, the financial regulators didn't focus so much on human trafficking and human smuggling as part of the financial crime mission. Do you want to talk about, you know, kind of the history of this and how it started?
Yeah, and thanks, Alma, and thanks for having me. Yeah, back in the early days, you know, sort of the late 80s, early 90s, when the program requirements were coming into place, FATF was formed. There was really a focus on the identification and reporting of suspicious activity generically. It wasn't focused on any particular crimes. And it actually wasn't until 2011 that the FATF came up with its money laundering risks related to trafficking of human beings and the smuggling of migrants is actually what that guidance was. And then it took the United States about another 3 years to come up with its first advisory on human trafficking and human smuggling. And then again, sticking to the United States, it wasn't until late 2018 that human trafficking and human smuggling were even categories to check off on the suspicious activity form. So it's been a very, very slow progress. And in fact, I recall back in 2008 with the institution I was at, I had attended a session in Washington, D.C. With a couple of NGOs that were involved with anti-human trafficking efforts. And I just came away so enthused about what we could do as an institution to try to prevent and detect human trafficking. And I went back to my senior management. I said, we need to get involved with this. And they said, no, we don't want to have any part of it. We don't want to be seen as being part of it. We don't want to be seen as contributing to it. Our bankers and our tellers have so much other things to worry about. We can't train them on the indicators of human trafficking. It's just too much. We don't want to be part of it. That's completely changed. I think this new generation, a generation I'm so excited about, I think the professionals today in our industry are so much better at the early stage of their careers than we were. They really get it now. They know that we need to really focus on the specific underlying activity. And I can't think of anything better than human trafficking.
So it's interesting you say that, Jim, because I was talking to an online challenger bank, and Sam, happy to know I was mentioning ATII and the information, and the chief compliance officer, who's kind of more our generation, said to me, our customers care about this. Our customers care about it. So I think you're right. They have a lot of younger, tech savvy, mobile, app customers, and they do care about social responsibility and social issues. So now some banks did get into the fight pretty early on. And Phil, when you were at JP Morgan pretty long ago, you helped to start those efforts there. You want to tell us a little bit about how that came about and what you did?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Back in 2009, what we wanted to do really was we wanted to work on more actionable investigations versus some of the things that came out of our traditional transaction monitoring systems. So instead of using our traditional transaction monitoring systems to try to find this type of activity, we dove into the data ourselves. We had a number of data analysts that we used, and what we tried to do is we tried to reverse engineer the criminal activity to come up with more of the same, where we can actually find it on our own. We work with HSI, primarily with HSI. We actually spend an awful lot of time studying our data, studying human trafficking itself, and trying to identify where the electronic choke points were within our system. And we were very successful first time around when we actually did this. What we were able to do essentially was flip the old model to the extent where typically your transaction monitoring systems produce a fair amount of noise. What we were able to do is, with our data mining effort, we were able to identify about 85% of what came out was actually actionable and solvable at the time, versus the 15% that it usually is with traditional transaction monitoring. So it was pretty successful.
That's incredible. Now, how did you get past the roadblock that Jim found at his organization with the board and with senior management?
Well, we did it.
It really wasn't in the forefront of things then.
No, it wasn't. We did it as a part of our mandate. Our job was to identify suspicious activity. Again, we flipped that and said, instead of just identifying suspicious activity, we want to identify money laundering. Again, we reverse engineered that type of activity. It wasn't our whole group that did that. So we still actually had a group of individuals who were looking at the alerts that were coming out of the system, adjudicating the alerts, so on and so forth. And I had a small group, a boutique group, I'll call it, of a number of diverse backgrounds. I had some data people there, I had some law enforcement people there, I had an attorney on the team, and a number of others. And that small group was the group that tried to identify through the data these typologies. And again, it was just a part of our mandate. And we didn't ask for permission. Once we did it, it caught on. And then we did it with other things, than other typologies as well, too.
So we have a great question about how can people think about using data in their transaction monitoring system. And I know Karim Rajmami, who's also a speaker and on the advisory board, has been doing a lot in this area. But Jim and Phil and Carol, do you have any suggestions on how institutions can take a cut of the data to try to find this, or as Sam said in her earlier presentation, differentiate it from other kinds of suspicious activity, because there are actual victims involved that need help? Any thoughts?
Well, I'll jump on that one. So, when we look at it, it's sort of the human trafficking, which is the movement of the people from one country to another is the most common thing. And that has to be paid for. That has to be sort of, there has to be financial transactions involved in that. But it's the sort of the servitude and the slavery that results from it that we can really see in transactions. And particularly for, when you have the sex trade at a truck stop or something like that, those people tend to move, and they move along major highways. And so you can see the activity moving along major highways and then settling in an area for a short period of time, moving on, settling, moving on, settling. So it's that moving on, settling pattern that you can see and pretty easily see it in the data. And then you're also going to see a lot of activity that isn't common activity to a retail type of an account. Most of us on our retail accounts, we earn a little bit of money, spend, earn a little money, spend. That's a very different pattern when it's someone who is under servitude and his or her account is being controlled by a handler of some sorts.
And what would that look like? What does that look like, Jim?
You don't have the consistent earning pattern. And then the spends are very, very different spends. They're very low dollars. There's hotels, way too many sort of cheap, low-end hotels, clothing stores, women's clothing stores. You see a lot of that sort of pattern.
Actually, I agree with Jim and some of the things that he said, but I'd like to expand on them. So what we did in the beginning is we used keywords. And if you're going to try to identify a specific activity, you have to, I'll say, fish with a spear versus fishing with a net. So you have to know what you're looking for. So in the beginning, we used keywords, and then from those groups of transactions that we received, we filtered them down with some of the things that Jim talked about, like travel, like hotel rooms. Back in the day, there wasn't Uber, but now 15 or 10 or Uber transactions in a day. That's something that you don't normally see. It's not just what you see in the transactions, but as Jim mentioned, it's things that you don't see in the transactions as well, too. So that was very helpful along the way. You don't see necessarily payroll. You don't see grocery purchases. You don't see some of the things that we normally would see in our accounts as well.
Yeah, and you don't see rent. That's the other
Yeah,
one.
that's key. Yeah.
Yeah, because most people have a $1,200 or 600 euros or
Right.
whatever it is every single month. You
Right.
don't see that on accounts of people who are subjected to trafficking. So
Right.
great point, Phil. It's what you don't see and should see that is as much
in that line, and then Carol, I know you have some great things to add. I'll get to you. One of the things in that don't see category is if you have a business that has lots of revenue, say a bar, but not much payroll tax, right? Or the number of employees you would expect to be employed at a bar or a restaurant or a salon of that size. That can be another one of those missing data elements that you're mostly going to find in the investigations, I would think.
Mhm.
In the data. Carol, I know what have you guys looked at?
I think just really to pick up on a point that Jim made, I think understanding the intersection between trafficking and other types of businesses is really critical. So Jim mentioned hotels, transportation, all of those intersections, and understanding all of those different points can help in the analytics. I think the other thing, in addition to what you don't see, is sometimes when you do see it. So activity occurring at hours when you wouldn't expect activity to be occurring for a certain business can also be a tip-off.
Exactly. We've got a lot of really good questions that I think you guys have been getting to pretty much. Although, so somebody asked, what type of human trafficking are we focusing on? Sexual exploitation, forced labor, forced organ removal. I mean, I think the sexual exploitation and the forced labor will look sort of the same. You're going to see these same things, these same patterns, oftentimes these anomalies in an individual account. Forced organ removal may look different. Does anyone have experience with what the red flags for that might be? Yeah, I would think maybe a big influx of cash in someone's account, if they have an account that is not explainable, might be one. And depending on where it's coming from, might be another red flag. You know, not a family member, not a business. Jeez, never says it. Sorry, everyone. The sounds of the pandemic, right? All right. So someone asked how to track transactions when payments are made in cash. I mean, obviously, the financial institution can only track deposits and withdrawals, but what are some of the patterns that you might see? Carol, what do you have your clients look for?
I mean,
Yes. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, go ahead, Phil.
So, yeah, in this segment, cash is primarily king. Again, you'll see an inordinate amount of cash activity or transactions in one of these accounts versus our accounts. You're not going to see some of the normal things as I had mentioned before. So as you're filtering down your activity, you take, for example, your keyword. Back in the day, you can use Backpage or something like that to go and grab your data. Then you filter those down by a number of different things: travel, cash, some of the things that we had talked about here. But cash is this is primarily a cash business.
And purchases of prepaid cards too, right? Can be another in large purchases or deposits from prepaid. Okay. So we talked about how this was not a big focus at the beginning. I know when I was at FinCEN in the 90s, it was all drugs all the time. And then shortly after September 11th, it was all terrorism all the time, much to the dismay of some of the drug enforcement agencies who didn't get as much funding as they had before or as much attention. So now I do think we are seeing a lot more regulatory focus. As you said, Jim, FATA, FinCEN just put out some red flags for human trafficking. What is the current state, do you think, of regulatory expectations in this area? Carol, do you want to start this time and then we'll go?
I think it was noteworthy last year that we actually saw a couple of enforcement actions, right? So we saw an enforcement action around Jeffrey Epstein. And then we saw an enforcement action coming out of Australia having to do with child sex trafficking. So I think that these enforcement actions can do nothing but, create more focus on this. And I do think that that's a change. I don't remember a lot of enforcement actions, if any, in this space before. So I think that is kind of signaling a bit of and I'm not suggesting that the regulators didn't care about this. I think it was, as we've discussed, a matter of focus and priorities and juggling priorities. But I do think this suggests greater attention. I think I was also encouraged to see in the AML Act of 2020, the requirement that there be a study on human trafficking and detection of human trafficking. So I optimistically would expect that coming out of that study, we'll have some additional guidance for the industry and additional focus by the regulators.
Yeah, and I think, after 9/11, it didn't take long for the FATF and others to add terrorism and terrorist financing as sort of a species of what we were looking at. It's been slower for things like human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, environmental crimes, et cetera. But as Carol says, we're getting there. We're moving in that direction. And it's just difficult, I think, for the regulators to enforce a focus on the underlying crimes through the regulatory process. And I think it's more incumbent on the institutions as we are moving towards an ESG approach, environmental social governance approach, to put things like human trafficking in that ESG bucket as a social responsibility that we owe to our communities. So it's going to be slow, but I think in the next couple of years, we're going to have the regulators asking us, what are you doing to target human trafficking?
And someone asked a question about that there are two ways you can see this, right? There's the transaction monitoring that we've been talking about and the analysis of the account activity. But Jim, to your point at the very beginning, and we did this a lot at some of the big money transmitters that I worked at, there are still ways that you have to train your frontline team to understand if a young woman comes in constantly with a handler, seems nervous, doesn't seem to have control. I mean, it was interesting to me as I started to focus on this. I was in Las Vegas a couple of years ago, and there is a sign in the restroom, the ladies' restroom, on the inside of the stalls with a number to call if you're being trafficked. And why? Because that is the only place that you go without somebody if you are in a trafficking situation. So I thought that was very interesting. So besides the more high tech, the transaction monitoring, the investigative focus, just some plain ordinary training of your frontline team to notice this and report it can also be a very important element. And that was part of FinCEN's red flag list from last year. Someone also had a really good question. We're kind of jumping around, but there's so much to talk about the use of cryptocurrency to obscure the payment for especially child exploitation and other kinds of trafficking crimes. But actually, cryptocurrency has some very valuable mitigants that aren't there in cash. Jim, you can probably take this one first.
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely traceable and traceable forever. I mean, much to the chagrin of the early users of Bitcoin and things like that on the dark web back in 2013, 2014, when they were told that it was anonymous. It's not, it's pseudonymous. And so the law, I mean, you know, in 25 years, you'll still be able to track down these guys. So, but it does, you know, it's sort of a layering approach really with the crypto. Going from fiat to crypto to fiat is a nice layering exercise, and it does slow it down. I can't say that I've seen a whole lot of it in the human trafficking space, at least on the retail end of human trafficking. It might be on the wholesale end, which is more of the criminal organizations that are doing it as a business, and less about the victim on the.
Carol, do you have some thoughts?
No, I don't really have anything more to add to that. I haven't seen a lot of it myself either.
Yeah, on the retail side, you're not seeing as much of it. You're seeing more now than back in the beginning, but you're really not. It's still, as I had mentioned, primarily a cash related business.
So somebody asked a really good and basic question, and that we all struggle with. How important is it to identify what kind of financial crime are you seeing, right? The obligation is to report suspicious activity, not necessarily to understand whether it's drugs or, you know, green crime or trafficking. But I do think more specific you can get in your suspicious activity reports, the more benefit to law enforcement. I mean, even though that seems obvious, Phil, you may have some more specific thoughts about that.
Sure. Actually, in the beginning, when we started to go down this path, one of the things that we ingrained in our folks was basically to investigate with a purpose. So when you're looking at suspicious activity, you may actually look at a set of transactions and deem it to be not suspicious. I may look at that same set of transactions and say, I think that's suspicious. But when we both look at human trafficking or a specific type of activity, we're both going to come to the same conclusion. So investigating with a purpose is in my opinion, much more successful in finding activity like this.
Yeah, I think to your point too, Alma, it's not an obligation, obviously, to identify the crime, but the closer you can get to that,
Yeah.
the more you can inform your practices, right? If you believe what you're reporting is human trafficking, I mean, that gives you information to go back and add to your analytics to look for other instances of human trafficking.
And actually,
Sorry.
providing that extra benefit, if you will, to law enforcement will probably get their attention a little more, which is what you want to do. And then hopefully provide you with a feedback loop that you know, at that particular, you provided them something that was actionable. Give us more.
And I do think there's provisions in the new Anti-Money Laundering Act requiring FinCEN to do more trend analysis and regulators to give you more input into what they want to see. And so that should, along with more public-private partnership, true information sharing, should give financial institutions some more information and also give law enforcement more information. And again, when you're talking about human trafficking, there are people that are being hurt now. I mean, there are in many, many crimes, but they are often people that US law enforcement has jurisdiction over to be able to save. And so I think that alone is worth the extra effort to particularly identify this as an issue. We did get, this audience is great. A couple of people have mentioned that another red flag for forced labor might be businesses with lots of refrigeration facilities, because fisheries, meat packing, those can all be businesses at higher risk of forced labor, and medical payments coming from countries with medical tourism businesses for the forced organ removal might be a red flag for that. I thought were great insights. Okay, so now we've figured out that everybody is or should be focusing on this now. Carol, what are some of the financial institutions doing to tackle this? Because as Sam said in her last presentation, this can often look like very typical behavior depending on what you think the client's business is.
And I agree. And I think to the conversation that we've just had, recognizing the indicators is generally only the first step. So if for the people who listen to Sam's introduction, having access to a database that might enrich the information you're looking at is certainly a benefit. And to everything Phil's talked about, I mean, being able to use that data and query that data in different ways is a necessity here. I think traditional transaction monitoring is only going to be the start in identifying human trafficking. And that is the challenge to the industry. So understanding kind of different data queries that they might use is something that I think is really important. You know, clearly, as we've said, a lot of institutions have done a lot of great work, but there's definitely room for improvement, and the more information that we can share with the industry on the types of analytics that they can do to identify human trafficking, obviously the better the results will be. And I think the industry is craving some of that information.
I think that's right. Jim, do you?
Well, you know, I think it's important that it's important that people understand that this is not a large global financial institution issue. You know, in the Midlands of the United Kingdom, or in the heartland of America, or wherever it is, this stuff happens everywhere. And so, if you know, again, if I was sort of running a bank today, it's that frontline teller and banker and relationship manager. I think you really need to make sure that they're trained, they're aware, and they know what the red flags are, because these are people who will come into a branch. These are people that will, you know, transact with a banker, et cetera. So having that frontline awareness and training is, I think, probably more important than having your customer surveillance systems being able to sort of tweak this stuff out. It'll certainly protect you as an institution if you have that frontline training that's happening. So,
Phil, do you have anything to add that maybe that what you're doing?
Yeah, I actually agree. Again, what we did in the beginning, and I keep referring, I'm sorry, but I keep referring back to that, is I interviewed a woman who had been trafficked. And in that conversation, she actually told me that she made friends with the bankers. She was the person who handled the finances for the operation. She had 9 accounts in her own name. She would split the transactions between those 9 accounts and walk into a branch every day. Knew the people in the branch every day. Like Jim's mentioning, if you can train your front line on some of those things to look for, that can be very helpful as well too. She just gave us a ton of information that we were able to actually then apply back to the data to help us begin the entire filtering process.
You know, those are really good points. And one of the things, I know there's a lot of use of technology and machine learning that we're seeing, link analysis that's really been helpful. But if you are one of these smaller institutions, there is a lot you can do that's low cost. As everyone said, really training your frontline associates not to be afraid to raise their hand and to spot this. And also, one of the things that we recommend sometimes is get 3 or 4 of your analysts, depending on the size of your FIU, and really have them study the red flags of this, the businesses that are implicated, the things that might not at first glance look like a problem, so that they can spot it more than your regular analyst that's looking for structuring or fraudulent loan repayments or something like that. And so those are kind of simpler, cheaper, lower tech ways. Somebody had a great question about, has anyone seen new patterns of human trafficking, laundering in the Gulf or the Horn of Africa? I think they look pretty much the same, but I don't know if anyone has any experience in particular in that region, but you're going to see a lot of the same things, the handlers, the lack of different kinds of transaction patterns. Now, if someone's a live-in domestic, and we see that actually a lot in the Washington, D.C. area where I live, where a lot of domestic workers are really trafficked, or it's modern slavery. So you wouldn't see rent, and you wouldn't see certain payments coming out of their account for things like room and board. But that's where the frontline training could be particularly useful, I think.
You're right, Alma. That's a great example of the frontline banker, because the transactions it's not going to be there in the transactions, but it's going to be there if and when they do attend, go to the branch or something like that. So
does anyone think we're going to see a change in regulation? There's a lot going on in the new Anti-Money Laundering Act, and a lot of areas that FinCEN's going to be required to study. This isn't one of them. So I wonder, hopefully we'll start seeing more guidance, but I don't know that we'll see a change in regulation. Carol, thoughts?
There is a study required on trafficking.
Oh, good. I missed that.
It's okay. It's a small print. There are a lot of studies.
It's 200 pages in my defense.
But there is a study on trafficking and identification of the detection methods that financial institutions could use. So again, I think that's pretty encouraging. There's a lot in the AML Act of 2020. I think it will take us many years to kind of see the full impact, but I think from the industry standpoint, there are some encouraging things. I mean, you mentioned the requirement that priorities be shared with the industry. I mean, I think that's another way, without regulation per se, getting the industry to focus more attention on whether it's human trafficking or any other issue, right? And getting the whole industry aligned and pulling in the same direction, where I think historically the frustration that the industry's had is not knowing necessarily what the priorities were and just trying to guess at those and do their best at guessing at those.
yeah, and on those studies, Carol mentioned, there's actually 2 of them, and neither one of them is specific to human trafficking. It's trafficking of humans, drugs, whatever it might be. But I thought the really interesting thing was those are not studies to be done by FinCEN or Treasury, but by the General Accountability Office, or GAO. So it's really, I think, focused broader than just financial crimes. And the big piece of legislation in the United States, or series of laws in the United States, are the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. I think it started in 2000 or something like that. It's sort of been amended every year, or TVPA. And so they're going to look at it more holistically. But I think it's a great development to put it in there. And we'll have regulatory expectations, but to your point, Alma, probably not regulations.
Yeah, FinCEN typically takes the provisions that these regs are broad enough to cover almost anything that you see that you have reason to suspect is related to a violation of law or regulation. But again, as we've noted, the focus does change over time. As we also talked about, it's becoming more and more important to our clients, and if it isn't, it should. So Jim, what would you do for some of your clients who are skeptical about the need to really focus on this? I know it's easy not to see it at times. So what's your argument? How do you help convince them?
Well, I kind of probably get a little mean or something. I mean, I was talking to a client the other day, and I just said, look, do you have a mother, a sister, a wife, a girlfriend, a friend who's a woman? I mean, this issue affects everybody, right? And it's just insidious. And we're all so privileged. If we're on this call right now, we're privileged. And I think we have an obligation to do the best we can for the most vulnerable people in our society. And so I just I hated to do it in a way, but I kind of shamed him a little bit. And he says, oh, fine, I get it. So I don't know. That was my approach. So.
No, I think that's a good approach, because you are helping them. I like the way you always say your regulatory problem in the next 2 years is sitting on your desk right now, and you just don't know it. And that's going to be one of them, right? As especially given the world economic situation, people get desperate. And that is when you get a lot of potential victims for human trafficking and forced labor, is desperate economic times, I think.
Yeah.
We also have the state's supply chain, several of the states focusing on supply chain, adding a little bit more attention to, not necessarily for financial services per se, but for a lot of other industries, which again, just ups the level of awareness.
Yeah.
And we have a really good question that Sam will be happy we got. I don't know who wants to take it. I think all of us probably could. What role does the information that ATII have in helping identify this? Anybody want to grab that? Huh? So one of the things, I think this is the best example. You have a business that the activity looks normal. It's the example Sam used in the introduction. They tell you they're an event planner and they are making large cash. That might be a little weird, but payments to hotels, to taxis and Ubers. And you think, well, that makes sense, right? They're helping somebody plan their corporate event, maybe not this year, but back to when we get to have them. But if you can use the ATII data to triangulate that with phone numbers in ads for escort services, or other negative news dealing with human trafficking on either side of the transaction, that might be all you need to understand that isn't legitimate, or at least to give you suspicion that it's not a legitimate business.
Yeah, I mean, the database or the data that ATII has available is, I think, as comprehensive as anything that's out there, if not more comprehensive, and sort of laying that over top of your ability to do the surveillance, et cetera. It's just incredible for targeting purposes. And it's that cross-reference you mentioned, Alma, that it makes it so powerful.
It's all about data. The data's out there, and you just have to find it, and you have to know how to use it. But if you do, it's stuff. Somebody asked if anybody had any specific red flags of money laundering in massage parlors, and I think a lot of them we've pretty much covered. Again, In particular, it can be a lot of revenue and not a lot of payroll tax is one. Anybody have some other thoughts besides the ones we've already talked about?
You know, some of the things that we looked at during the Super Bowl when it was in Minneapolis, we looked at off-hour, and I think Carol mentioned this. We looked at off-hour transactions, and that was helpful. And you'll see some of that in the massage parlor arena. So that can be useful. But one of the things that we should probably touch on as well is public and private partnerships. What we can look for and how we can interact with law enforcement to get better information. When we work with law enforcement on situations like this, we try to do it in a non-threatening way. You can't just go and say, who are you looking at from a human trafficking perspective? But you have to build the relationship or enough of a relationship to be able to say, what does it look like to you? And by saying, what does it look like to you, and getting that trend information, you might be able to take that and it might give you just what you need to actually exploit your data to find that type of activity. So every time we got into an event like the Super Bowl or any of the golf tournaments or whatever, we brought law enforcement in with us and worked with law enforcement throughout the entire process. And again, we did it in a non-threatening way where we weren't asking about specific individuals. We were asking about trends, asking about, for the most part, the how, so we could produce the what.
And that is really what the industry needs across a variety of issues, which again, one of the things that I think is planned is more public-private partnership to share trends and information and new typologies, right? Because I mean, one of the problems with what we all do is we're sort of a little bit cleaning up behind the elephant parade, right? It's people's jobs to find new ways to get around what our institutions are looking for. And it's hard to keep ahead of them. So anything that law enforcement is seeing can often be a big help, just like anything that we're seeing, we might see it first before they do. And so that can all be, it's always helpful to exchange that information.
So, Alma, may I ask Phil and Jim a question from their industry experience?
Please do, yeah.
So I'm curious the extent to which you found opportunities to work with other industries, because there are clearly initiatives in hospitality, airlines, other sectors looking at trafficking. To what extent did you see opportunities to partner there?
So let me start, and Jim can jump in. What we did around the Super Bowl, we didn't actually do this on our own. So we brought other banks and other industry into the team with us. So we brought some of the hotel industry or the lodging industry. We brought obviously the banking industry. We also brought transportation in with us as well too. And as you mentioned, Carol, it was great understanding the different perspectives in each one of those industries and how we can then apply that information to our data. Because, you know, as Alma mentioned, it's all about data for us. And it just made us that more successful.
Yeah, I mean, Carol, great question, because we always talk about public-private sector partnerships. And when we talk about the public sector, we're thinking about law enforcement. We're talking the private sector, we're thinking about banking.
Yeah.
But there's way more on the public sector than just law enforcement. And then on the private sector, it's not just financial institutions. I feel like you
Right.
said, hotels, it's the transportation industry, trucking, all sorts of different groups, and they all bring a different perspective. So that very well might be the next sort of wave. And depending on the jurisdiction you're in, depending on the ability to share information across the public and private sector, if you're in the private sector financial institution space, partner with the hotels and sort of the lodging industry as well. That would be a very, very effective way to do it.
Construction might be another area. Somebody asked a question about forced labor that isn't sex trafficking, and you do see that in construction, again, in meat packing, in certain agricultural sectors, in Europe, in Africa, you have a big problem with forced child labor in cocoa production. So you're right, Jim. It's a broader, the banks can't fix everything, but they can certainly, and maybe it would refine the red flags, right? To know what is a retail drugstore looking for, because they often see the victims of human trafficking with their handlers. What are they looking for?
Mhm.
There's a lot of information out there that we can share. I'm just taking a quick, I think we're almost out of time. And there are a lot of questions here we're not getting to, but we'll try to answer them afterwards, won't we, Sam?
Yes. Hey, Alma. Yeah, we have a little bit more time, and I'm going through and answering some of these, and then we will have a register of all the questions after, just in case we don't get to any here or we want to do a little further detailing. You guys are doing awesome. We have another 30 minutes if you're up for it. We're up for it, and I know the attendees are up for it. Thank you.
Okay, so here's a good, now I'm just going to go through the questions, I guess, because I think we've pretty much talked about, I think because we didn't have Fred here, we got done a little sooner. We miss him. Well, I'll just go through some questions, and anyone on the panel who feels free can jump in. And it's a good one because the US is behind in attorney obligations for identifying all kinds of financial crime behind the rest of the world. What role can attorneys play in assisting financial institutions to enhance their money laundering and training initiatives? Any thoughts? I mean, I think any free training that a financial institution can get, they usually are happy to take advantage of. So maybe the ins and outs of what's legal, what's not, might be really helpful, especially for the frontline team.
Yeah, I mean, again, I mentioned the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in the United States, and most countries have similar legislation. It's pretty complicated, and it goes way beyond sort of the traditional financial services type of laws. So yeah, if you could find a law firm that would help you understand that a little bit more and the obligations you have there. And it doesn't hurt to kind of scare your senior management and directors a little bit that there might be some civil liability from the TVPA to sort of help you get a little bit of cash for your human trafficking prevention programs. So
juice it up a little bit.
Yeah,
that, and again, in the new money laundering statute, the potential to be barred from being an officer and director in a financial institution for BSA violations, I think this also might be another way to scare people who, if you think you're really resource starved at your institution. Let's see, excuse me, guys, I'm just, Jim commented that this can be international or a local small town issue. So how would you be able to share or partner across borders? Because it isn't like most crime, the criminal activity is global, but our law enforcement jurisdiction is still relatively local. So how can institutions help with that?
So I'll go out on a limb here. So from a financial crimes perspective, and we do have like GDPR and everything else. We have to be very, very careful about sharing, we call it, PII, sort of the private information of our customers and our clients. But as far as sharing typologies and strategies and techniques, you're freely able to share all of that. And so that's where I would focus. And you might want to label it under this ESG label, the environmental social governance label, rather than financial crimes. And then I think you're probably going to, from a regulatory perspective, you're going to be a little safer off.
Yeah, that's a problem that's remedied by Section 314B in the US that doesn't necessarily, it doesn't apply to sharing information with foreign financial institutions. Another element of the new law, though, except in limited circumstances, will let you at least share more information with foreign affiliates. You could share with a foreign parent, but now you can share with foreign affiliates. So while it doesn't eliminate the problem of cross-border issues, you can at least share more freely with your own entities in other countries.
And I think, Alma, another sort of information sharing or awareness issue is, from a drug trafficking perspective, we know which are the source countries, and then we know which countries those source drugs are going to and how the money flows. You have to make yourself aware of what are the source countries for human trafficking as well. And I think that's really important because you're going to have migrant communities in your country, whether it's the United Kingdom or the United States, wherever you are. And to really understand, is that migrant community really, a one that is suffering from human trafficking? And then you can kind of sort of get your awareness and even your monitoring and surveillance change to adapt to that.
That leads to a good question. How should financial institutions be thinking about changing their risk assessment? Again, in the new statute, I think with FinCEN's giving trend information that is supposed to flow into your risk assessment, you're going to have to kind of have an agile risk assessment process. So this is the time to think about those risks you're not finding. So what kind of, made me think of it, Jim, when you talked about countries that are sources for human trafficking. Carol, how are you helping your clients adjust their risk assessments to find this?
I think it comes into play in a couple of different areas, not just the geography, but that's a good point. I think customer base too, right? Kind of going back to the types of businesses that we've talked about that could be indications of higher risk. And I have to say, in my experience, human trafficking has not been all that explicit traditionally in risk assessments. So I think there is a definite opportunity to kind of improve the thinking and make sure that the risks of human trafficking are more explicitly brought into the risk assessments.
Yeah, you should have it in your country risk assessment and then in your customer risk assessments as well. Massage parlors, nail salons, those kinds of businesses, I think. But I know ATII has got a good list of countries. IOM does as well. That's the, I'm blanking, International Organization for Migration. They've got some sort of good country risk assessments there. So I would make sure that your country risk assessment, at the very least, includes human trafficking attributes. That'll protect you from a regulatory perspective.
There's some State Department information out recently too, I think, on kind of like the INCSR, the Narcotics Control Report. We're talking about how robust the human trafficking prohibitions are in those other countries, which is part of it, right? How vigorous are they in enforcing these statutes and these laws? Another issue that's changed over time is the focus on the victims. Because I was on a panel with a former prosecutor last year who was talking about how one of the issues is oftentimes law enforcement would treat human trafficking as an immigration problem, which focuses on the victims, not on a human trafficking problem, which focuses on the people who are making money from those victims. I think that's starting to change too. I don't know if you guys have had experience or have seen that. But I think that's a welcome change, because I think that's one reason sometimes the victims are hesitant to say anything is they don't have a passport, they aren't here legally, or they aren't in the UK legally, or France, or wherever they've been trafficking, the Gulf. So let me see if we have any other. I think there are a lot of questions here we haven't specifically addressed, but we've addressed them, I think, in substance. Oh, somebody asked, how can a young professional develop skills and qualifications to get involved in this fight from the financial institution side? Are there specific quals or education that's important? I don't know of anything specifically. I know ACAMS has some modules and some webinars on this quite regularly. There are tons of free resources like the ATII website and some of the others. Anyone else have good suggestions for somebody who wants to help?
I would probably answer the same way for all of financial crimes. It's kind of caring, and especially in this instance, and having the curiosity. I personally don't think there's any type of education that prepares one better for doing this work. It's really having the commitment and the interest and the innate curiosity to follow the money trail.
Right.
Great. Let me see if we've got anything else here that we need to answer. There's some great questions, folks. Like I said, we've gotten to many of them. So someone asked, there's evidence that terrorist organizations and cartels are working together to carry out operations. How can we more accurately identify those at risk and provide more protection for those populations? I mean, I think that goes to the points we were talking about with geographic risk. Countries with high incidences of human rights violations and a lot of civil unrest, obviously people often want to leave or are made to leave. And so that's one way to take that into account. And again, you may not know whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking or weapons trafficking, and then you just file your SAR, but it's important to try to dig down a little bit and be more specific if you can, I think. So with that, Sam, I think if anybody has anything, anybody have any final words for this group? All of our years of, of experience. Not that we're old or anything.
I'll just weigh in with and sort of follow on what Carol said about, being curious and really wanting to focus on this area. I think if you're young in the financial crime space, that you couldn't pick a better place to focus on. I think human trafficking is as insidious as anything that we have. And if you really want to make a difference in this industry, you can put your curiosity and your talent and your courage and your compassion to work in this space. And I think if you really want to make a difference, this is where it is.
And we are lucky in the area we work at, because I know this sounds kind of corny, but we do make a difference, maybe in little ways, maybe on the margin, but we do make a difference every single day in helping keeping the world just a little bit safe. And as I said, I know that sounds kind of corny, but it's absolutely true. And the longer you're doing this, the more you believe it, and it makes it very fulfilling and rewarding.